Well, let's continue our presentation on the civil religion, which is the overall theme. But let's move over to the civil religion in America, because this is obviously the main focus of these 4 presentations. And let me recap once again my main thesis, my main argument, which I tried to present to you already in the 2 presentations earlier on. I believe the civil religion of France, which we could call the religion of humanity or the cult of a supreme being, or just the Jacobin policy, the philosophy/religion of democracy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this particular religion has been imported to America. Now it has been changed, it has been updated, it has been readjusted, revised to fit into this particular culture setting. But it's still the same religion, it's still the same idea behind that particular democracy which is being propagated in America in our time, and actually already for quite some time. But before I go into explaining how it's being done, I need to set the stage, so to speak, in order to explain certain aspects of civil religion which obviously are very unique to the country of the United States of America. Let's define what we mean by civil religion. It is a shared set of values, beliefs and narratives and practices that give a society cohesion and purpose. As you know, this was really the intent of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wanted to give cohesion, unity to the country or nation where his philosophy would be implemented. But this could be generalized, which is really applicable to every single society or nation where any kind of civil religion is being implemented. And in a different presentation, I go further into explaining that every single nation, every single society has a specific predominant civil religion. It doesn't need to be Christianity. It could be Buddhism, it could be Islam, it could be any kind of other religion. Or it could be that kind of religion, as I explained early on, the religion of democracy. But every nation has its specific civil religion. It draws from the highest common factors inherent in the religious faiths of the society, as well as from the society's culture, secular philosophy and history. These are just the components which make up that kind of civil religion. It has certain aspects of Christianity. If I speak about the American civil religion, it has certain aspects of Christian religion woven into it, but also certain aspects of Enlightenment philosophy have flown into it or have been incorporated into it, as well as obviously certain historical developments. A civil religion stands separate and apart from dominant religion, but not in deliberate contention. This is also a very important aspect which we need to keep in mind. A civil religion can go very well with a predominant religion such as Christianity. It can almost look like as if it would be Christianity. So it's not necessarily fighting against that predominant religion, but it can appear like it is part of that dominant religion, whereas it might be ultimately something completely different. Let us just look at some examples of the civil religious beliefs. And I just pick up certain slogans, such as America is God's chosen nation. A president's authority is from God. Social justice cannot only be based on law, it must also come from religion, or such holidays like the 4th of July are looked upon as, in some ways, religious, as well as patriotic. And you know, just about every politician ends his speeches with "God bless America." The American civil religion consists of a mixture of Protestant and democratic values. Personally, I believe that both sets of values are quite distinct and different. I'm not equating one with the other. I'm not saying democratic values are equal to Christian values and vice versa. As a matter of fact, sometimes I even believe they are almost antithetical. But it's the mixture of both sets of values which make up the American civil religion. And it does exert its influence in the public square, in politics. You just need to turn on the TV and listen to some of the news channels. And you will very quickly be confronted with certain values being expressed, which go back or derive from the civil religion. The civil religion reinforces the Redeemer nation myth. And what do I mean by Redeemer nation myth? America is divinely chosen to spread Protestantism and democracy throughout the world. This has been a topic of historical investigation for quite some time. Later on, I will mention some historians, American historians, who devoted quite a bit of time and a lot of effort in researching that particular aspect of the so-called Redeemer nation myth. As I define it here, America is divinely chosen to spread Protestantism and democracy throughout the world. And it's very enlightening, very helpful to understand or to read about the conclusions these historians have come up with. But we will turn to that in a little bit. One of the, let's call him famous sociologists of the 19th century was Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French fellow who came to America to study the American system. And in his quite famous set of books where he describes what he researched and found when he did that study here in America was the following. He had a very high value of, or very high opinion of Christianity's value in American society in the early part of the 19th century. He saw Christianity as the source of basic principles of liberal democracy. And he was very much in favor of liberal democracy. And he thought that Christianity was supporting these values of liberalism in the positive sense. Not in the sense, not according to the definition liberalism has assumed in the 20th century. So in the sense of classical liberalism. He thought that only religion was capable of maintaining liberty in a democratic era. So you take religion out of the picture, and by religion we truly meant Christianity. You take Christianity out of the picture, you will lose a society based on classical liberal principles. So basically free enterprise and things like that. You will lose that kind of society. And he also looked at Christianity as the bulwark against dangerous tendencies towards individualism and materialism, which would lead to atheism and tyranny. So he was very much opposed to tyranny, atheism. And he said that Christianity really fulfilled that particular function in American society to keep the population away from these dangerous tendencies. Once again, Alexis de Tocqueville thought of Christianity's influence on American society of the early 19th century in very positive terms. Christianity infused the country with a strong sense of morality and reinforced the belief in progress. Once again, both values and objectives, if you look at progress as an objective, which Tocqueville viewed positively. But there were other philosophers, especially in the 20th century, who opposed that particular understanding of America as a free society based on Christian principles or Christian values. And such a philosopher was John Dewey. He wrote a book, a very famous book, called A Common Faith in 1934. And in that book, he defined clearly what kind of faith, by that he meant civil religion, what kind of civil religion Americans should adhere to. And by common faith, he meant every single American should adhere to these values. Let us just summarize some of the content of what Dewey expressed in his book, A Common Faith. And this is basically just taken from the dust cover of that particular book, which is a modern publication of that book, which was published in 1934. One of America's greatest philosophers outlines a faith which is not confined to sect, class, or race. Dr. Dewey calls for the emancipation of the true religious quality from a heritage of dogmatism and supernaturalism that characterizes historical religions. By historical religions, he meant really Christianity, or someone who summarized the content of that book in looking at what Dewey thought of Christianity. By historical religions, he meant Christianity. He describes a positive, practical, and dynamic faith, verified and supported by the intellect and evolving with the progress of social and scientific knowledge. End of quote. So this is basically what is written on the dust cover of that book, summarizing the content of it, of what that common faith should be. It should not be Christianity, because Christianity is characterized by dogmatism. And certainly we don't want dogmatism. We want a positive, practical, dynamic faith. And it's a faith which is evolving. And obviously is derived from social and scientific knowledge. There are other sociologists in America who looked at that particular civil religion, which Dewey was promoting, and which in some ways took hold of the American society due to the fact that Dewey had a very strong influence on the educational system in America. One of those sociologists was Robin Murphy Williams. He wrote about the common religion in America. And I give you the sources of these sociologists, their particular books. I won't recite them in detail now. So they recognize a specific civil religion in place in America. Williams called it the common faith. Lloyd Warner analyzes the religious meaning of a Memorial Day celebrations, once again as an exercise to gain a better understanding of what a civil religion is all about. And the historian Martin E. Marty talked about a religion in general. So all of these terms describe the same phenomenon. describe the existence of a civil religion in America. Common religion or common faith or religion in general. One commentator who became quite famous in his time was Will Herberg. He used to be a communist, and he changed his ideology and became an outspoken neoconservative. He lived from 1901 to 1977. And his particular research interest was America's civil religion. And he described it very clearly, very explicitly, very extensively, as in terms or in reference to America, or America he looked upon as the most religious, the most secular of nations. So in some ways, he saw a contradiction within that particular civil religion, or at least how that civil religion was working itself out within American society. In one way, in one sense, he looked upon it as utterly religious. In a different other sense, he thought that America was rather secular, perhaps the most secular nation. And when he tried to understand why that is, and he came up with the idea that America is really a triple melting pot. And he pointed to the predominant segments of American society who adhere to a specific religion: the Protestants, the Catholics, and the Jews. Obviously, if he would live in our time, he would need to add quite a number of other religions to that equation. But in his time, in the middle of the 20th century, he could still, with a good conscience, point to three predominant religions: Protestant, Catholic, and Judaism. And he wrote about the fact that all three melted into the culture, but all still stayed distinct from each other, and all were serving the American way of life. So they melded, they mixed with each other to some degree. They still stood apart from each other, and then they obviously supported what he describes as the American way of life. What is the American way of life? Once again, he defined it as such. The American way of life serves as spiritual structure of all American ideals, aspirations, values, beliefs, and standards. It synthesizes all that commends itself to the American as the right, the good, and the true in actual life. And in some ways, it is a pragmatic, dynamic faith. Deeds, not creeds, are emphasized. And if it's pragmatic and dynamic, it can change, and does change. But there are certain values which are predominant, which can be readily picked on or picked up in regards to that particular faith. You can readily see them. These are, that faith is humanitarian, forward-thinking, and idealistic. In the following, I will just mention a few other historians or sociologists or commentators or novel writers who are also making the civil religion as a very important topic of their publications. One of those was the historian Sidney A. Mead. He explicated the religion of a republic. Another one was a British writer, G.K. Chesterton. He said that the United States was the only nation founded on a creed. And he coined the phrase, a nation with a soul of a church. As you can see, these are all, in some ways, religious descriptions. Other historians, such as Ariely, Boston, and Gabriel, assessed the religious dimensions of nationalism, the American creed, cultural religion, and the democratic faith. The sociologist Seymour Lipstadt referred to Americanism, the American creed, to characterize a set of values that Americans hold with a quasi-religious fervor. These are again just examples of some intellectuals, some historians, some cultural commentators who understand that there is a religious faith operative in American society, which can be called by these terms and described in a religious language. But the most famous of those historians or sociologists was a professor of sociology at the University of California in Berkeley, Robert Neely Bailar. And if you do a keyword search in Google, you will very quickly come to his name if you just type in civil religion America. His name will come up probably as the one on top of the list. And he coined and popularized the term American civil religion. This is really what he has become known for. Well, he is deceased. He died in 2013. But he's still the one whose name is directly linked with the concept of American civil religion. And here's his book, which he published on that particular topic. Well, before he published the book Beyond Belief, Essays on Religion in a Post-Traditional World, he published an article in the Journal of American Academic, Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1967 by the title Civil Religion in America. And based on the popularity of that particular article, he wrote the book Beyond Belief and published it in 1970. And I just tried to summarize very quickly the main ideas which Bailar promoted or described in these two publications, his article and his book. He argued that the American civil religion is distinct and it's a cultural phenomenon within American society, not embodied in American politics or denominational religion. Remember, I said early on, a civil religion is something completely or is something different from a dominant religion in a society, but it can still go alongside that particular dominant religion. And I believe this is very true for America. It's something very distinct. It's a distinct cultural phenomenon. But you cannot equate it with American politics. And you cannot equate it with any particular religion, be it Christianity or any other religion, such as Buddhism or Islam and such. But you can still observe it very clearly if you pay attention. If you open your eyes, you will see specific signs, specific clues, specific indications of that particular religion in force, in society, very quickly. Just look at that book about President Carter. It's just simply called Redeemer. And the book author meant Carter to be a redeemer. Well, the term redeemer is a very religious term. And a Christian would readily associate that term with only one person, and that person was Jesus Christ, or is Jesus Christ. So if you use that particular title for a biography about one particular American president, Redeemer, you have a specific understanding of what that particular president was all about or meant to accomplish. And it was a religious goal, a religious vision which he wanted to implement, at least according to that particular author. And when it's also very easy to find other symbols about that civil religion, which in some ways try to make a connection to Christianity. But if you look close enough, you see that it has nothing to do with Christianity at all. It just appears to be Christian, or those who produce or paint these images or make these collages like the one at the right lower part of this slide want to convey a specific religious message by using Christian symbols, but conveying a message which is not necessarily Christian. Well, the question is America a Christian nation? And you see the cross which is hung around the Statue of Liberty. Once again, let us come back to Robert Neely Bela. How did he define American civil religion? Well, he argued that America was founded on Enlightenment concepts of the laws of nature and nature's God, on the belief that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, these are directly taken from the Declaration of Independence. But the question needs to be asked, are the laws of nature the same as, for example, the laws of Moses? Is the God of nature or nature's God the same as the Christian God? Is that concept of nature's God, which comes straight out of the Enlightenment era, the same as what we as Christians think of our God, who revealed himself as Jesus Christ? These are very important questions, and we try to answer them, and my personal understanding of it is they are very different. Very different indeed. Just merely that someone of the founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson, used the term God, doesn't mean he meant the Christian God. Why can I say that? Well, simply because if you look at the Jefferson Bible or Jefferson New Testament, he cut out just about half of all the passages which he found offensive to his understanding of true religion. So he had an Enlightenment understanding of religion. And that really goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his particular religion, which he promoted in the 18th century in France primarily, or at least the Jacobeans promoted that particular religion in France. And Jefferson was very strongly influenced by these concepts of a religion which is really very much apart from what we understand true Christianity to be. Robert Neely Bela argued that American civil religion would provide sacred days, places, and events, solemn rituals and symbols. And indeed it did. It did. The civil religion would be used to bolster democracy, and the American Republic would create a shared civil religion that endowed generic Christian values and honored a divine being. Once again, just one example. I just picked this up by doing a keyword search on Google. A banner on the 4th of July celebration, Happy 4th of July, and then underneath is a Christian, or is a Bible verse taken from John 8, verse 36. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Obviously, the person who made up that banner wanted to have the concept of freedom, which is expressed in that particular Bible verse, be the same meaning which is conveyed by celebrating the 4th of July, meaning the founding of or the publication of the Declaration of Independence, which eventually led to the founding of the American Republic. Once again, I'm just merely summarizing what Bela wrote in his book. The American civil religion stems primarily from the American Revolution. This is the main source of a civil religion. And he points at George Washington and describes him as a Moses-like leader. He points to Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and calls them prophets. And then you also need some martyrs. You have the Boston Massacre and Nathan Hale. You have some apostles, such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. You have some devils, King George III, Benedict Arnold. You have some rituals, raising the Liberty Tree, holy flags, stars, spangled banner, sacred holidays, such as 4th of July, Memorial Day, Thanksgiving. You have Holy Scripture, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. He also argued that the civil religion could be used to provide national ideology, to legitimize the existing social order, to buttress social cohesion for rebellions and reform movements. And slowly but surely you see a convergence taking place. If I use these terms, cohesion, for example, or legitimizing an existing social order, all of these we already encountered by looking at the civil religion in France. And I'm not saying one is the same as the other, even though the terms are identical. But still, slowly but surely, we see a convergence of meaning taking place, to the point where, as I argue later on, to the point where both will indeed become one and the same. It's interesting also to look at some of the book titles which are being published in more recent years. One Nation Under God. Interestingly enough, the same title is being used by a different book, also called One Nation Under God. Two different books, same title. In some ways, Bela, even though he was a Marxist, we have to keep this in mind as well. He has his specific ideological persuasion or had until as long as he lived. He was a Marxist. There's no doubt about it. But he still saw some value in the civil religion being practiced in America. It would allow freedom of religion. It would guarantee the separation of state and church, or church and state. It would enable church and state cooperation. As not just separation, but also cooperation. He looked at these consequences, outworkings of the civil religion as positive developments. Once again, he tried to define the civil religion. And since American society has been strongly influenced by Christianity, the terms or symbols of Christianity have been taken over by the civil religion, such as biblical archetypes, chosen people, Exodus, promised land, sacrificial death and rebirth, and New Jerusalem. But the important point is these so-called biblical archetypes are devoid of true Christian meaning. So if someone uses the term chosen people in reference to the American nation, it doesn't mean that God has chosen the American people, all of them, Not at all. Or America is destined to bring New Jerusalem to this world. But once again, New Jerusalem has a very specific meaning in the book of Revelation, for example, in the last 2 chapters. But if someone uses that term, it doesn't mean what will take place at the end of time, as described in the book of Revelation. At the end of the 19th, at the beginning of the 20th century, certain American politicians became known for being exponents and propagators of civil religion. One of those was Albert Beveridge. In one of his speeches in front of the Congress, he said the following: "Mr. President, the times call for candor. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God, of the civilization of the world, and we will move forward to our work with gratitude for a task worthy of our strength and thanksgiving to our Almighty God that He has marked us as His chosen people, henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world." End of quote. The regeneration of the world. Well, this is nothing else but what Jean-Jacques Rousseau wanted to accomplish or see accomplished. This is exactly what Robespierre picked up from Rousseau in terms of what he wanted to see accomplished. The regeneration of the world. And all of a sudden, you have an American politician at the end of the 19th century who called America to that task. Early on, it was France. When Robespierre was at the height of his power, he called France to accomplish that world redeeming mission. And all of a sudden, you see an American politician calling America to fulfill that role. The primary purpose of being a chosen nation, America should be a society as perfectly in accord with God's will as possible, and also a light to all the nations. Again, I'm not diverting from my source. My source is still the book by Robert Neely Bela in his attempt to describe the civil religion of America. And one understanding, one term, one notion of being a chosen nation, America being a chosen nation, comes to the fore. And this is what America should do. And again, we are talking about the end of the 19th century. America should be a light to all the nations, and so on and so forth. American Revolution established its civil religion without rejecting Christianity. Now, this is important because this is so different from France. France established its civil religion during the French Revolution in utter opposition to Christianity. Whereas in America, it was different. The civil religion was instituted without rejecting Christianity. And here we see a clear difference. This is why in America it became rather popular, fashionable for politicians to borrow from religious language or from the Bible to support their policies, or even clergy endorsing Republican values of the culture. Robert D. Linder wrote in an article published in the Journal of Church and State in regard to President Bill Clinton's use or portrayal of civil religion. He labeled President Clinton to be the universal pastor. This was actually the title of this particular article: Universal Pastor, President Bill Clinton's Civil Religion. Let me just quote from this particular article. throughout American history, the president has provided the leadership in the public faith. Sometimes he has functioned primarily as a national prophet, as did Abraham Lincoln. Occasionally, he has served primarily as the nation's pastor, as did Dwight Eisenhower. At other times, he has performed primarily as the high priest of the civil religion, as did Ronald Reagan. In prophetic civil religion, the president assesses the nation's actions in relation to transcendent values and calls upon the people to make sacrifices in times of crisis and to repent of their corporate sins. Their behavior falls short of the national ideals. As the national pastor, he provides spiritual inspiration to the people by affirming American core values and urging them to appropriate those values, and by comforting them in their afflictions. In the priestly role, the president makes America itself the ultimate reference point. He leads the citizenry in affirming and celebrating the nation and reminds them of the national mission, while at the same time glorifying and praising his political flock. End of quote. Now, this was a longer quote, but I think it was still quite insightful, quite revealing. If you look at the role a president in American politics plays in being, in some ways, a prophet, some ways a priest, some ways a pastor comforting those who are entrusted to his political care. Well, the one president who exemplifies that particular role as a pastor of the nation was really President Benjamin Harrison. He, in some ways, perfected the use of religious language in his speeches to bring or to convey a political meaning. In his speeches throughout the 1880s, he displayed a rhetorical style that embraced American civil religion. One of Guido's most adept presidents. He applied Christian ethics to social and economic matters. He gave impetus to the social gospel and the progressive movement. And he created the national climate to solve social problems by government action. Well, another American president who, in the mind of most, or at least many, who exemplified that kind of role as the pastor of the nation was President Ronald Reagan. In a biography by Mary Beth Brown, he is portrayed as in that particular religious role. The title of that book was called Hand of Providence, the Strong and Quiet Faith of Ronald Reagan. And once again, even in the title, the terms being chosen to summarize the message of the book are anything but subtle. They point clearly to at least some faith, and obviously the connotation is to the Christian faith. On the dust cover of that book, I found the following summary. The book expresses the life and personality of Ronald Reagan by focusing on his deep-felt Christian beliefs and showing how faith guided him along his distinguished career and led him to his unprecedented success. Brown, who is the author of that biography, Brown weaves a magnificent story of Reagan's strong devotion to God that will not only inspire Christians to enter public service and allow their faith to motivate all their actions, but also help point others to the cross of Jesus Christ, a cause that was near and dear to President Reagan's heart. End of quote. Once again, even that summary is full of religious terminology, even very explicitly Christian terminology. His faith in Jesus Christ, or he pointed others to the cross of Jesus Christ. And this may come as a surprise to some, but the commentator William Sapphire noted of Clinton's presidential campaign in 1992. Never has the name of God been so frequently invoked, and never has this or any nation been so thoroughly and systematically blessed. Can you understand that? Can you relate to that statement? Well, obviously we can go back to the year 1992 to revisit some of these speeches. But if it's true, and I don't have any doubts that it is, even William Jefferson Clinton was very adept in using Christian terminology to convey to his audience that in some ways he's guided by the values of Christianity. He appeared on occasion behind a Christian pulpit, and he assumed self-consciously the role of pastor of the nation by incorporating in his speeches religious terminology to a fault. So that was deliberate policy. It was a self-conscious effort to incorporate these religious terms, especially Christian terms, Christian terminology in his speeches, to let his audience know that he's very favorably disposed to the Christian faith. In some ways, that calls to mind what Niccolo Machiavelli wrote. Remember how I quoted him? When he advised the prince of a ruler or rulers of his time how they should appear faithful, pious, and yet be able from one second to the next do the very opposite of what these values stand for. Bill Clinton promoted a universalistic outlook by making no sharp distinction between the domestic and the foreign in presenting his vision of a world community of civil faith. A world community of civil faith. Now, once again, this is nothing else but picking up on the vision of Robespierre, who also wanted to regenerate the entire French nation and ultimately the entire world based on his particular understanding of a religious or the sacred, the cult of the supreme being. So in other words, Clinton wanted to export the civil religion of America to the entire world. Now, he can do this only if he tones down its Christian content. If it was ever in any way derived from Christianity, which I obviously dispute. Well, you have had another President, George W. Bush, who was very adept in doing the very same thing which he saw Clinton do. But please note the following, and this may also come as a surprise. President George W. Bush rarely used language specific to any Christian belief. Rarely. Now, he used terms which sounded very religious. No doubt about it. And I assume that quite a number of Christians were thinking that he is speaking of a Christian faith. But some historians did an extensive analysis of the terms he actually used and came to the conclusion he did not use or did not often use terms which referred directly to the Christian faith. One of those historians is Manfred Bocker. He wrote an article in the Journal of Political Science published in January 2004 by the title of Civil Religion, Fundamentalism, and the Politics and Policies of George W. Bush. And this is what he found. Indeed, Bush used often civil religious metaphors and images. And Bush's foreign policy was based on American security interests and not on any fundamentalist teachings. And finally, and this is the last slide for this particular presentation, we will come to a close very quickly. We have the example of President Barack Obama. As a matter of fact, this particular image was taken in 2008 when he was still a presidential candidate, soon to become president. And it was taken at the Saddleback Community Church, the church which is pastored by Rick Warren. And Rick Warren had deliberately invited him to come to his church to take part in a public forum alongside of John McCain, who was also invited to participate in that particular forum to present their particular political views to that particular church. And that particular service was then broadcasted across the nation. President candidate Barack Obama portrays the American nation as a people unified by a shared belief in the American creed and sanctified by the symbolism of an American civil religion. And it is taken from a campaign speech from that particular year, 2008. So what we see really is, starting with President William Harrison in the late 19th century, who used specific Christian terminology to describe his particular religious outlook, to eventually William Jefferson Clinton, who also was very keen on using Christian terminology, to George W. Bush, who rarely used Christian terminology even though he did use it, to Barack Obama, who basically never used it. All he said was related to the American creed in general, which he did not define as, in some ways, derived from Christianity. You see the progression over this past century, or longer than a century, from explicit Christian terminology to basically no Christian terminology at all in the public speeches of an American president. Thank you.